Welcome to the Beau Show. Thanks for watching. You may remember the famous Deflate-Gate scandal with the New England Patriots a few years back and deflating footballs that created an endless supply of memes. Well, what is happening right now in the United States is the opposite of deflation. It's inflation. And it is a scandal in many ways because bad policy creates this phenomenon. I want to take some time today to explain it and the possible underlying reasons. According to sources ranging from CNBC and CNN to the U.S. Energy Information Center, they state that over the past year, food prices are up 3.5%, with eggs and meat up by over 5%. Gas, as we all know, is up 22% and is expected to be even higher by this summer. Lumber is up 250%. New home prices are up $36,000, with overall housing up 11%. New cars are up 9%, the highest in 68 years. In April, 13% of new car buyers paid more than the sticker price. Other goods, such as household items, baby care, and general merchandise, are already up between 5 and 7% from this time last year. The cost of eating out shot up by 3.7% over the past year, and some takeout specials such as chicken wings have nearly doubled. You've noticed these price increases wherever you turn. Gas was just really the latest reminder. And it needs to be mentioned that Colonial Pipeline, they actually paid the $5 million ransom to get back into their system. So much for not caving in to terrorists. But these cost increases are what you might call the invisible tax. Just because Joe Biden said only the rich will be taxed does not make it so. When basic goods go up, who does that affect more? The rich or the working class? Then you have the increase in commodity prices, things like microchips that go into our cell phones, our TVs, car parts. Those are up 25%. Increased corn prices, as well as pork, soybeans, and wheat, also affect a bevy of goods. So basically, prices are the highest they've been in over 8 years. One of the main reasons for recent inflation is how the Federal Reserve is printing money. The Fed almost doubled its bond purchases since the beginning of the pandemic. So from February of last year to March of this year, the money supply circulation went from about $15 trillion to about $20 trillion. Then you have the supply chain itself, which has been hampered by a year of tough times. So when you reward people with government stimulus, it creates a higher demand for goods and then thus pushes prices up. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is at its fastest rate since 2008. George Selgin of the Cato Institute said the following: "Now, people are spending again, and obviously April's numbers show that they're spending even more aggressively than forecasters. Most of them anticipated. There are some adverse supply shocks going on, some of which affected the April numbers. But the big story is the pent-up demand and purchasing power that people have finally started to dispose of." End quote. So this is, let's say, the primary driver of inflation. The second main cause is government spending. This came with the pandemic and these emergency measures which were whisked through Congress rather speedily, which, as we know, now has had a bunch of projects entirely unrelated to pandemic relief. Pork, as you may say. So when we hear Joe Biden asking for a $2 trillion infrastructure plan, another $2 trillion in social spending, and the $2 trillion for pandemic relief, we tally that up to about $6 trillion in new spending. The Hill's Kristen Tate has outlined all of this beautifully and very thoroughly in an article you can find online on The Hill, which is where I'm getting a lot of these stats and even some insight so that I can educate myself on what's actually going on financially. I encourage you to read it. But for the purposes of my audience, those of you watching today, and even if you aren't a policy wonk or a numbers guy, and I'll face it, I am not, I like getting the Cliff's Notes version to help me understand. Because when you start talking trillions with a T, it starts getting really, really heady. It's hard to do the math. Biden's Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, does not seem to be too fazed at all by these numbers and thinks inflation will be mild and temporary. With all of these supply chain issues that we saw, plus a labor shortage created by vast extended unemployment, whenever the cash starts being spent, it will be spent on a limited supply of goods, which again spikes inflation. If you're under about age 40, you wouldn't remember the inflation of the 1970s, but Biden knows this because he was in the Senate then. You would think he'd be keenly aware of the pains of the 70s, as well as the gas shortages. This is why he gets compared a lot, I think, to Jimmy Carter, but you would think that a guy like Joe Biden would have the experience to avoid the mistakes of the past, but he seems poised to repeat them with $6 trillion in new spending. And remember, this inflation is the invisible tax that is hitting the working class. This has nothing to do with the actual taxes he's proposed. But I guess you can see he's being an equal opportunity taxer. You wouldn't want to let any crisis go to waste, right? Or any person to be left out of such good tax. LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, hey, they all deserve to get a little extra tax, don't you think? Got to be fair. Got to be egalitarian about it. I don't imagine this is really what Biden voters voted for, correct? You weren't voting for higher prices on chicken wings or filling up the truck, were you? These are the unintended consequences of elections. Bad policies. This is when you have to question things like infrastructure, which sounds all well and good, but may have very little to do with infrastructure itself, the roads and bridges. It's like less than 10% of the bill. You can't spend your way out of debt or recession. That's when you become very fiscally responsible. And when I hear some people say, oh, I'm fiscally conservative but socially liberal, I think, well, but you still voted for Joe Biden, who is no fiscal conservative, not even moderate. Neither was George Bush, of course, but it's the social issues that get all of the press. And that loses sight of the severe financial impact of politicians and policies. And the problem is that Biden conditioned you into this by a spending spree by using the pandemic as a precursor. The first round of stimulus, okay, sure, I get it, absolutely. Second round, third round, and then unending unemployment, then labor shortage. After a while, people just expect that tough times mean time to collect. And my guess is that most people would rather be able to afford gas and school supplies and basic necessities than get a brand new bridge. And then redirecting federal funds from states who manage the pandemic very well, like Florida, and sending those funds to California and New York. So many businesses unnecessarily shut down over the past year. And I think whatever pandemic we will see next, and rest assured, there will probably be one, business owners are not going to be so acquiescent. Remember the hair salon owners that got arrested? Yet Speaker Nancy Pelosi was out getting her hair worked on in California. So this is the combination of Federal Reserve printing monopoly money and flooding it into circulation, as well as creating the cash for these big spending packages, combined with the supply chain issues that I mentioned and limited goods. This is a recipe for disaster. And we thought the 70s were bad. And I'm not trying to fearmonger you because I see that all the time. I'm just pointing to the facts that we know and the patterns and the mistakes of the past, which we have to learn from. Brady and the New England Patriots got in trouble for deflation. Biden and the Feds are inflating the economy with reckless spending, which may entail interest rates being hiked up in 2022. Can you imagine how bad that would be? We've enjoyed a great economy for a little too long, and that was too good to be true forever. China has accumulated U.S. Treasury securities over the last few decades. As of January 2021, China owns a little over $1 trillion, or about 4% of our debt. They do this to keep their export prices lower and need to keep their currency, the RMB, low compared to the US dollar. Now, while it seems dangerous if China were to sell off all these bonds, it seems unlikely to happen, given the damage it would do to itself. But you probably recall how Donald Trump was trying to even the scales when it came to trade with China, who had been ripping the US off for decades. More importantly, though, China didn't need to do anything financially with trade at all, because the coronavirus, which was studied at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through something called gain of function research. If you don't know what that is, watch the exchange between Tony Fauci and Rand Paul. It's the manipulation of a virus to transition it from animals to humans, either accidentally or completely intentionally. The Chinese allowed that virus to escape in Wuhan, and we saw the repercussions. It crippled our economy. And they did this without any change in policy or lifting a finger or a weapon. And that is why these types of biological weapons will be very important to mitigate moving forward. Let's just say this was an accident. And we don't know if it really was. China fully permitted it to escape and infect 163 million people and kill almost 4 million. Whose nation did it kill the most citizens of? The good old US of A. Even if this was unintentional, look at the blueprint it gave to China or any other bad actor. But I like to approach my perspective always from a base of common sense. And we see, Joe Biden's treasury printing more money, and then on top of it, it goes on a spending spree for projects that are not our basic necessities. How is this sensible policy? Inflation is a very real thing, but I'm trying to break it down for you where it makes sense. And I think most of you understand it because you're paying for it right now with your wallets and your purses. Basic goods are more expensive. You're paying more for gas. And this is what happens when you tell everyone, oh, don't worry, we just want to tax the rich people, because that sounds good and everyone seems to agree with it. Everyone, the rich should pay more. But then when good working people pay more for goods, the picture doesn't look so rosy. That's where your tax is, you see? I myself did not really understand the complex issue of inflation until I studied it, and now I see the impact of it. Then, if you include the impact of the border crisis, where hundreds of thousands of people could potentially flood the country, who may not be financially self-sufficient, you heavily impact not just the federal, but also the state governments. We don't need to go into a recession after the pandemic, when everyone, all of us, had to make huge sacrifices, and many lost jobs and their businesses. But it seems they are poised to do this. It just doesn't make logical sense. So for Janet Yellen to get on the podium and admit that inflation is real, but that it will be mild and temporary, is not very comforting. We've also heard so much from this administration about economic inequality. It's one of their favorite branded statements. As the Wall Street Journal has reported, the cost of living is outpacing wages. Inflation is rising at 4.2%, while wages are only rising at 1.2%. When you adjust that for inflation, wages actually decreased 3%, the worst since 1980. This makes inequality that much more unequal because lower earners have to spend more of their wages on basic living expenses compared to the wealthy. Therefore, you get more inequality, the very thing Biden and his team have been saying needs to change. So if this keeps happening, and the policies that Biden are suggesting, from this big spender infrastructure bill to other wish list projects, America's working class can expect to suffer. Perhaps the saddest thing is that we don't really know whether Biden is actually pushing this or not. He has such brain fog that it's hard to know what he is actually doing. So here's the thing. If he is in full control, it's bad policy. If he's not, whoever is pulling the strings on Puppet Joe is also recommending bad policy. That is why your vote really does matter. It did seem a bit coincidental, did it not, that the CDC miraculously dropped the mask guidelines as all of this was going on, didn't it? That was quite an about face to put a silver lining on the Biden clouds. Gavin Newsom is out in California promising his constituents all this money, like he's Santa Claus. And that's clearly an effort to win them over as he faces a recall. And this is why things are so bad, guys, that politicians are not actually acting in your best interest, but in their interest of keeping your voting them into power. Biden wants more votes, so he creates a border as porous as Swiss cheese, and then tells states that they shouldn't be requiring identification to vote. You see what I mean? That's asinine. It's policy that's based on emotion and vote getting, not what's best for you and me. This is where you have to parse policy from personality. Millions of people voted for Joe Biden based on his more diplomatic demeanor, without understanding his poor, misguided policies over decades. The track record was there. It speaks for itself. It's terrible. Someone with that much experience in government should have a fair understanding of what to do. But this inflation nation has reminded us that a 4-decade politician is just another politician. Thanks for watching today. And as always, please subscribe to get my latest episodes. I'm Beau, and that's the show.